Hi, I'm Jess Flanigan. I teach in the Jepson School of Leadership Studies and the PPEL program here at the University of Richmond. And today I'm talking to our forum speaker for tonight, Dr. Peter Singer, who's a professor of bioethics at Princeton University. And welcome to the University of Richmond.
Thanks,
Thank you
Jess.
for coming.
It's great to be here.
So my first question is about how you see philosophy moving forward as a discipline. So when you first wrote Animal Liberation and Family, Affluence, and Morality, you broke a lot of new ground in applied ethics and in political philosophy. So I'm wondering, what do you think are the new exciting areas of research within political philosophy and applied ethics? Where do you see the field going?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I do think that we've made quite a bit of progress since then. For one thing, applied ethics has become an accepted field of philosophy, which it really wasn't fully when I was an undergraduate, say. So that's good, and I think we're going forward with that, and we're going forward with political philosophy as well. It's never easy to pick the new areas that are going to emerge.
Yeah, well, what are you excited about?
I think there are a lot of interesting questions in issues about where we're going in terms of our species and our development. So there's discussions about enhancements of various kinds, some discussions about the possibility of genetic enhancement, but we don't have to go that far. There's enhancement in terms of pharmaceutical enhancements, cognitive enhancements of various kinds. Are we going to become transhumanist in some way so that we actually develop into a different kind of being, and what would be the values that would inform that kind of development? That's something interesting. As you know, as you mentioned, Animal Liberation, I've been interested in questions about our relations with non-human animals and trying to understand more about animal minds, what animals experience, and then trying to work that into ethics in terms of how we do trade-offs between human suffering and animal suffering. Those are interesting questions, I think, and important questions.
Oh, yeah, those are all really exciting fields. That's interesting to think about. So right now you're working a lot on effective altruism, and recently some people have responded to the effective altruists critically. And so I was wondering what your thoughts were on a specific line of criticism. And here I'm thinking most about Angus Deaton, but also William Easterly, and some other economists who are very skeptical of the effective altruist program, and they think that it could actually be harmful to have massive influx of aid to the developing world. So I know you've responded to them in print a bit, but I'm curious, what would it take for them to convince you, and what do you think it would take to convince them? What's the main source of the disagreement, and how can we make progress on that debate?
It's a good question, but first let's locate the disagreement, because I don't see Angus Deaton or William Easterly as actually being critical of the underlying ideas of effective altruism, which is that we should make the world a better place if we can, and we should make doing that an important part of our lives, and we should draw on evidence and reasoning to work out how to make the world a better place. Certainly if I take Angus Deaton, who of course is my Princeton colleague and whom I know well and have had a lot of discussions with, we share the value of trying to make the world a better place, of trying to help people in extreme poverty become better off, have lives more like ours. But you know, he's critical of whether the idea that aid can make that difference. That he thinks rather that it may be that we should try and reform governance in some ways, or try to change global institutions that make people better off, or even do research in this country on diseases that exist in developing countries. So he thinks it might be, say, highly effective to try to develop a vaccine against malaria, doing research in this country. He's concerned about the effect of aid on other countries in terms of flows of money, which may cause their currencies to appreciate and make it harder to have exports. And he's also concerned about poor governance, and he thinks that somehow it lets governments off the hook if too much aid flows in. So these are questions, if you like, they're factual questions which I think effective altruists ought to consider or to see whether that's right or not. But the general principles that say we ought to try to make the world a better place, they're not really disagreeing with.
Deaton and other people who are critical of individual contributions as a means for effective altruism, they advocate for political solutions. And I was wondering if you could talk about some of the other ways of helping people who are in poverty worldwide outside of individual direct contributions. And so here I'm thinking about open borders. And I was just going to ask your thoughts on open borders.
Okay, so first let me just say, to finish off the conversation about Deaton and Eastleigh, that I think it's clear that some forms of individual aid do make a significant difference, do save lives. And clearly we've been reducing the incidence of malaria. There was a recent study in Nature that came out, showed that, suggested that the distribution of bed nets was the major factor in doing that. So that's just one example. And I think Angus Deaton at least would agree that some of that health aid has been effective. He refers to antiretrovirals for HIV/AIDS, for example. So I think there are interesting questions there. But certainly there are other possible solutions to global poverty that are worth thinking about and worth trying to see. Firstly, would they work? Secondly, is there a strategy to get there that has a likely chance of success? So you mentioned open borders as the idea that we would really try to abolish the borders that prevent people in particular moving from one country to another. So I think there are studies that suggest that would make a dramatic reduction in global poverty, because people who are poor could move to other countries, and that would benefit economies worldwide. But here you have to ask, is this a politically feasible thing to do? And with some regret, I have to say that at the moment it strikes me that it's not feasible. And in fact, I think just in the last few months, what's happened in Europe with the refugee crisis suggests that it would be very difficult to really open borders completely. Because of the very limited influx of immigrants into Europe, I mean very limited compared with what would happen if you completely opened borders, there's already a significant political backlash in various elections in European countries. The extreme right has done a lot better. And if you completely open borders, I think that would really exacerbate that problem. And maybe even there would be violent resistance. There have been a couple of incidents in Europe of that, people burning down buildings where refugees were or something like that. And I think there could be a lot more. But anyway, I don't think politicians would really embrace it at the moment. They'd be too frightened of losing votes. So it's a nice idea, but the way people are, unfortunately, at present, I don't see it as practical.
I'm curious about your thoughts on paternalism. So in the past, you've argued in favor of a right to die on the grounds that people have the right to make their lives shorter in order to make their lives as a whole better. However, it also seems like you are open at points to things like smoking bans and other kinds of paternalistic policies to promote public health. Are those two views in tension, or how would you reconcile those two thoughts?
Well, on the question of the right to die, I'm not basing my view purely on individual autonomy. If I did, I'd have to favour laws that essentially would say anybody who wanted to die should have access to the same means of dying as somebody who's terminally or incurably ill. And I'm not sure that that would be a good thing. At the very least, I would want to see some kinds of controls to make sure that this was a thought-out, considered decision, that it wasn't like the lovesick teenager who says, my true love has gone, the world is not worth living without her, I want to end my life. And we all know that you might feel like that for a week or a month, but then you're going to think that the life is worth living again after that. So that's there's an element of paternalism, you could say, in that, making sure that people are making careful and well-considered decisions. Now, in the case of something like smoking, and I'm not sure, by the way, that I do want to ban smoking. although I would certainly want to discourage it in various ways. A better example where I clearly do embrace paternalism is legislation to require people to wear seatbelts or to require motorcyclists to wear helmets. And I think that's because there's evidence that we're rather poor at making decisions to reduce risks that are already fairly small. So every time you get in a car, the chance that you're going to be in an accident where your seatbelt will prevent death or injury is very small. But you know, putting on the seatbelt is a very simple thing to do, and it does significantly reduce that risk. So I think on balance it's clearly a wise thing to do, a prudent thing to do, and because we're so poor at making those decisions, I think it's good to have some incentive to make them. And the idea that you might get fined $100 or so if you don't do it seems to me a reasonable sort of incentive.
One worry I have about that, about seatbelt policies, for example, so take primary enforcement seatbelt laws, is that it is true that if everybody wore their seatbelts, there would be fewer deaths. But it doesn't follow that, on balance, outcomes would be better from having seatbelt laws, because then you would have to add up all of the fines and the discretionary power of the state and people feeling paranoid or worried about police interfering with them. Do you have a kind of hierarchy of how you rank what sorts of harms or what sorts of benefits or burdens to people matter? Because even though it is true that a primary enforcement seatbelt policy would save lives, there are these other kinds of costs, political costs or costs to a person's maybe dignity, that you'd have to weigh against it.
Well, those costs can, but I don't actually see those costs. I mean, you know, I happen to have been living in the first jurisdiction in the world to make seatbelts compulsory, the state of Victoria in Australia. I don't see any evidence that people in Victoria, or for that matter anywhere else in Australia, are paranoid about police powers. I think they're much less concerned about police powers than people in the United States, in fact. I don't see that people see it as an offence to their dignity if they get fined for not wearing a seatbelt. It doesn't happen very often because people do wear seatbelts, and they might be annoyed. But I haven't heard of anybody saying I was humiliated by the police who gave me a ticket for not wearing a seatbelt.
Turning to other questions of individual behavior. So one question that I have is about your views on utilitarianism being kind of rationally required. So your kind of new turn through your work on Sidgwick. So do you think that people who are not utilitarians, that they're making kind of a rational mistake in some sense?
Look, it's very hard to say that because I know that there are highly intelligent people who have thought hard about these questions who are not utilitarians. So it is hard for me to say, look, I think they're making a rational mistake. But I suppose you're right that that is in the end an implication of my view, that if they would think carefully enough, if they would put aside non-rational intuitions that get in the way of reaching that judgment, go through an ideal reasoning process, that they would come to the conclusion that some form of utilitarianism is correct.
Well, I'll keep working on it. So do you think that utilitarians that fail to live by those types of principles are also making a rational mistake?
That's another it's a separate question. And it's somewhat more difficult because I acknowledge that I don't myself live 100% according to utilitarian principles. You know, I mean, I give substantial amounts to effective charities, but I'm sure that I could do more good by doing more. So am I being irrational in doing that? Well, I certainly think that I'm being self-interested. And then, of course, there's this great issue which Sidgwick grappled with about whether, in fact, there are two sources of rational action. The universal good or impartial good that utilitarians talk about, and the self-interested good that egoists talk about. So that's what Sidgwick thought. That's what contemporary philosopher Derek Parfit thinks, who's another philosopher that I greatly admire. But I was led together with my co-author, Katarzyna de Lazari-Radek, in my recent book, our recent book, The Point of View of the Universe, to think that there's a kind of evolutionary debunking argument against that kind of self-interested view as well, and that if we were purely rational beings, we would act for impartial good rather than for our own good. So I suppose that's the position that I hold. To that extent, I'd have to say I'm less rational in not doing that. You might say, well, but given the kind of being that I am, I'm just not a purely rational being, and no human being is a purely rational being. It may not be irrational for me to give some weight to my self-interests that's more than the weight I give to anybody else's interests. That might be one answer to that question.
Do you think that there would be something lost if everybody were following what you thought to be the right moral theory? So here I'm thinking about the sort of Susan Wolf moral saints concerns, that if people really embraced a moral theory fully in their lives, that something about our humanity would be sacrificed for that.
No, I think Susan Wolf paints an unfairly negative picture of moral saints. And on that, actually, you know, there's the recent book by Larissa McFarquhar, Strangers Drowning, which I think is a really interesting book and describes people who are pretty close to being moral saints. They're not necessarily all completely moral saints, but they're actually fascinating and interesting people who live rich and full lives. And I don't think they're at all obnoxious. I think, on the contrary, they're the kind of people that I would like to be around. Some more than others, I would have to say, of that group. But for example, she talks about Julia Wise and Jeff Kaufman, and I know Julia and Jeff, and they're involved in the effective altruism movement. And yes, they live by highly demanding moral standards, more than most people, but I have no problem thinking that they are as fully human as anyone else that I know.
Yeah, if not, you know, more,
if not more
interesting
so.
And fascinating and kind of admirable. I tend to agree, but I was wondering, because I imagine that you hear that a lot, that people are worried about the over-demandingness of morality or something like that.
Yes. So there are aspects of that you could imagine being off-putting and destructive of a lot of important aspects of our life. You certainly don't want people, you know, lecturing you in a self-righteous way all the time about what you ought to be doing, but a moral saint or somebody who lives by demanding morality doesn't have to do that. There's the old objection about your friendships and your, you know, being really close to people. Can you love somebody or be a really close friend and not give more weight to their interests than you give to others? Mm-hmm. So maybe you can deal with that by saying that, in fact, it's necessary for us to function well, to have close personal relationships. And that gives us a kind of a license to do that in order to continue to function well and flourish, and in the long run, to do more good and not to burn out in the process.
I think that might be right. Because that sort of gets to my last question, which is about having kids. And so I think maybe one thing that really makes you feel the force of moral reasons is having other people in your life who you really, really care about. And then you start to kind of, the value of other people's humanity really gets a grip on you. And one experience that people have that causes that is having children. And as a utilitarian, I would imagine you'd be really in favor of people having lots more children. And so some people call it the repugnant conclusion, but some people say, that's just bad PR. We should just embrace this because it'll be a world full of lots of happy people who are living great lives. So what are your thoughts on having children and the moral merits of doing that?
Well, I do think that a world with lots of people living great lives is better than a world with few people living great lives. But the question, of course, in a world that already has 7.6 billion people in it and has serious problems, I believe, with anthropogenic climate change, whether having more children is going to exacerbate that and is going to mean that instead of the world having more people living great lives, it'll actually end up with fewer people living great lives because of the somewhat unpredictable further ramifications of climate change once we pass some dangerous threshold, which it seems we're close to doing. So if I knew that the facts were such that the world could actually hold more people living great lives without causing severe harm to others, I would be happy to embrace that conclusion.
Even if the average were lower?
Well, definitely. I think even if the average were somewhat lower, I would embrace that conclusion. The repugnant conclusion, of course, suggests that even if life was just barely worth living, but the number of people was vast, that would still be better because the total would be better. I must agree with you. I find that conclusion actually hard to reject because all of the other theories that you might hold that you think don't lead in that direction tend to have their own paradoxes and problems. And it's very hard to find a consistent view which isn't the view that just says maximize total well-being.
Right. And why introduce a kind of perfectionism at this point without accepting perfectionism in other parts of your utilitarian calculus?
Yeah, I think the idea that, you know, life has to be a certain level above the life that's worth living to somehow have extra value is difficult to defend.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, thank you so much for answering all of these questions. I can't wait for your talk tonight, and thank you for coming to the University of Richmond.
Thank you.